Thank you very much, and what a pleasure to be with you all. I remember the summits I was able to be there for in person, and the tremendous level of energy that one could feel in the room. So I congratulate all of you, and of course Tiki in particular, for what has already been built in Africa around this concept of shared value. You know, it is 10 years almost to the day since this article on creating shared value was published in Harvard Business Review. And I have to say, some days it feels like a very long 10 years. Other days it feels very short. But it's been a journey for me. And frankly, it's been an unexpected journey. You know, I started off working with Professor Michael Porter at Harvard on the concept of strategic philanthropy. Our idea was that if we could help charitable foundations and donors be more strategic about their giving, we could make more progress on solving social issues. And that's why when we started the nonprofit consultancy FSG, we started it named Foundation Strategy Group, because our original thought was to work with large charitable foundations. But as we began to do our work and began to study how social change really happens, we realized that companies, corporations, have much greater impact on social issues than charities do. In fact, if you think about the 100 largest economic entities in the world, 2/3 of them are companies rather than countries. And if we think about our daily lives, you think about the number of times you interact with a product or service or piece of advertising from a company, it's overwhelmingly more than we interact with nonprofit organizations or even government. The reality is companies shape our world and our lives. And if we want to solve the extraordinarily challenging and difficult problems we face as a world today, we need to engage companies in the process, not as philanthropists, not as corporate social responsibility that is simply reducing harm that a company might cause, but to really make them partners in shaping the solutions to the problems we face. Now, of course, philanthropy is important. We can't replace that, and it does a lot of good. But philanthropy tends to be very fragmented. You know, people pick a particular organization to try and solve complex problems. But the reality is these are systemic issues that no single organization is going to be able to solve. And of course, government is absolutely essential to building a sustainable and fair and equitable society. But unfortunately, government in most parts of the world today is broken and is not really serving the interests of its citizens. So like it or not, I believe we are left with companies as the most promising agents of change for the almost overwhelming problems that we face today. And I have to say, as I think about the last 10 years, I'm both very optimistic and also quite frustrated, because there's a lot of good news, but there's also some bad news as well. When I think about the good news, it's clear that the world is moving toward this concept of creating shared value. People use different words to describe it. They don't always use shared value terminology. Sometimes they talk about inclusive capitalism or stakeholder capitalism, or they talk about B corporations or mutual benefit. There are many different terminologies out there, but all of them at the essence are about putting a social purpose at the core of a company's strategy and operations. And that is a truly positive thing. You know, when Professor Porter and I wrote this article 10 years ago, we said something that seemed a little crazy at the time. We said the best way to make money in the world today is by tackling the world's social problems and finding profitable solutions to them. Well, at the time we published that 10 years ago, the most valuable company in the world was Exxon. And Tesla was a struggling early stage company that had just gone public at $17 a share. Well, today, of course, Tesla is worth 20 times the value of Exxon. It has made Elon Musk the richest man in the world. And for better or worse, it has demonstrated the power of finding innovative solutions to our society's problems and how much economic opportunity lies in finding those solutions. And what is really remarkable to me when I think about Tesla is not just the company itself, but the industry-wide shift that it has made. Every major car company in the world has now committed to moving toward electric cars over the next 5 to 10 years. Tesla itself was started 18 years ago. So if I put those two numbers together, what we are seeing is a fundamental shift in the entire global automobile industry in the span of 30 to 35 years. That is actually extraordinary. And I do give Tesla the credit for having made that happen. That is tremendously optimistic. The problem, of course, is that every industry needs to go through a similar transition. And to be honest, I do not see it happening at scale yet in any other industry. You know, I've learned a number of things over the 10 years since we wrote that article. And one of the things I've learned is that there are really three categories of companies around creating shared value. There are those that are born with a sense of social purpose and mission, and Tesla indeed is one of those. There are those that are making products or services that are beneficial, but they haven't yet been intentional about this idea of creating shared value. And they need to find ways to change their strategy and operations to be more intentional. So, for example, I think of pharmaceutical companies. Their product is good for people, is good for the world. But at the moment, their focus is still on affluent countries and affluent customers. And it takes a real change in their business model to think about how to reach populations in Africa and in other parts of the world that don't have easy access to doctors and hospitals and pharmacies. But we've begun to see a number of pharmaceutical companies like Novartis beginning to make that shift and find new ways to make their medicines accessible to populations who haven't seen it before. And I consider those to be companies in transition to shared value. And then there's the third category, which is companies whose product or services we now know today are harmful to people or planet. Now, it's not because those companies are evil. The reality is when oil and gas companies started or coal-fired power utilities were first built, we did not know about climate change. The reality is that when companies that sell sugary beverages or food with a lot of salt and fat and sugar started, they didn't know about the social determinants of health and the health impacts of those ingredients. In industry by industry, I see companies operating on business models that were developed decades ago. In some cases, like banking or insurance, they were developed centuries ago. And those business models need to change today, just as fundamentally as the auto industry is changing. And those industries, I think of industries that have to transform themselves. So whether your company is a shared value company that was born with shared value, that is transitioning to more intentional shared value, or the hardest case that has to transform its business model to a new model rooted in creating shared value. Every company has an opportunity to create shared value. And as I say, there's a lot of reason to be optimistic. We see more and more companies moving in this direction. We see tremendous progress in how companies are reporting on their social impact. That used to be a real morass of undefined terminology. But today, companies are getting much more sophisticated in identifying which are the social and environmental impacts that are material to their business, and how can they communicate that in a meaningful way, not just to activists and NGOs, but to their shareholders. And how can they integrate it with their financial reports? How they can communicate to shareholders the way in which their social impact affects their economic performance. And I see tremendous progress on the part of the investment community itself. You know, last year in the US, 25% of all new funds that went into mutual funds went into ESG funds, funds that claim to focus on the environmental, social, and governance performance of the companies that they invest in. And that's a remarkable statistic. Just 5 or 6 years ago, that number would have been only 1%. So whether you're looking at companies, whether you're looking at NGOs finding ways to partner with companies, which I increasingly see examples of, whether you're looking at investors, we are seeing progress in how companies are thinking seriously about their social impact, not as something that is peripheral to their operations, not as something that is left to a small CSR department over on the side of the main operations, but recognizing that these issues are central to their operations and that they can make material change at scale on these issues in the regions where they operate. But I said that in addition to the good news, there's bad news as well. I serve on the board of a group called the World Benchmarking Alliance that was set up by the United Nations Foundation to track corporate performance and progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals that the United Nations have set. And the World Benchmarking Alliance is studying 2,000 leading companies around the world in different industries, including companies that are based in emerging markets, as well as those that are based in developed countries. What they're finding is deeply, deeply discouraging. Out of the 50 largest electric utilities in the world, one has committed to eliminating fossil fuels. 70% of them are actually on track to dramatically exceed their targets of carbon emissions. If I think about automobile companies, of the 30 largest automobile companies on this planet, only 5 have made any commitments whatsoever about reducing the climate impact of the gasoline and oil that they sell. And even those 5 are not actually on track to meet the targets they have stated. When I think about food and agriculture companies, out of the 350 largest food and agriculture companies in the world, only 12 have goals that are consistent with the Paris Agreement. And when I think about human rights, more than 90% of the companies that the World Benchmarking Alliance has studied would score a 2 or less on a scale of 1 to 10 when it comes to defending human rights in their operations. So the progress we've seen in the auto industry is not happening elsewhere. And as we listen to the news coming out of COP26 in Glasgow, we have to recognize that the urgency of the problem is far greater than the pace at which companies are moving. So for all the acceptance of the idea of creating shared value, we are not doing nearly enough. We are not moving fast enough. You know, I teach a course on purpose and profit at Harvard Business School, and I teach it to second-year MBAs. And I have to say, as I talk to MBAs, I find that they still believe that the purpose of a company is to maximize shareholder value. They still think that paying attention to the welfare of stakeholders is a distraction from maximizing profit. They don't get the connection between competitive advantage and social impact that is at the core of creating shared value. And I've come to see that the decision to create shared value is a choice. It's a choice that people can make. There are plenty of ways to make money in the world that are bad for people and bad for the planet. And there are a lot of people who've decided to pursue those paths regardless of the consequences. But what 10 years of work in creating shared value and studying examples all over the world has shown me is that there is another choice that is possible. And that is the choice to make money, to be successful by helping to solve the world's problems, by shifting business models to take into account not just the harm that companies cause, but the positive impact that they can create in the world. And industry by industry, we're seeing more examples of that. Insurance. I couldn't give a talk about shared value in Africa without talking about Discovery Insurance from South Africa that has found ways to use incentives to lead their customers to engage in healthier behaviors, exercise, eating healthier, getting regular checkups. And as a result, their customers get sick less often, recover more quickly, have a longer life expectancy. And that enables them to be a more profitable life and health insurance company. They have changed the whole model of insurance from merely spreading risk to the idea of actually reducing risk by creating incentives that lead people to engage in better behaviors that are better for them and better for the company. And industry by industry, I find examples. You know, in the utility industry, renewables are now more profitable than fossil fuel. And it's great to see companies like Enel that are really embracing and leading the way toward a future that is rooted in renewable energy. So there's a lot to be hopeful about, just as there is a lot to be discouraged by. But what I have to say is that I've come to recognize that this choice of whether to live a life pursuing success and profit and wealth by creating harm, or living a life pursuing those same things by doing good, is a very personal choice that each of us needs to make. And I think there is an urgency to this choice today. We need to look at what each of us is doing in our lives and make the decision about which choice we will make. And I'm tremendously optimistic about the future of Africa, because Africa, I think, has the opportunity to leapfrog the developed world and move directly to a model of building shared value companies and industries, of looking out for the well-being of all stakeholders in a way that established industries in developed countries are finding it so hard to shift. There's no reason that companies that are emerging and starting in Africa today need to start with a harmful business model when we know what we know today, and they can start instead with a shared value business model. And I'm particularly hopeful when I look at the young entrepreneurs who are starting new businesses around the world, and in particular in Africa. They are finding innovative solutions that older generations would not have thought of to the world's problems. And they're finding ways to build businesses that address these problems. And I've increasingly seen that when a company is started with a sense of social purpose, it can grow rapidly and go to great places that other companies have not achieved. And so I know we are coming up to a panel with some of the youth and entrepreneurs that are launching these businesses in Africa today. And I'm eager to turn the conversation over to them and begin that panel discussion. So I want to thank you for letting me be with you today. Again, it is such a thrill to see shared value take hold on the Africa continent. And I look forward to joining the panel of youth that is coming up. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Kramer. I believe for most of us here, we are pro-choice as far as shared value is concerned. So we will hope to convert as African Council of 8 members to keep promoting and convert more useful people to implement shared value principles in their business. I am Afechi Awono from Ghana. I run JBW Limited, a private multi-industry business support services firm, operational in several jurisdictions across sub-Saharan Africa. We focus on energy, defense, and immigration solutions. I'm also a member of SVAI's Africa Council of 8, a group of thought leaders and trailblazers committed to promoting the principles of shared value in our various ecosystems. With me this afternoon are colleagues and co-council of 8 members, Ala Mohamed from Egypt, and Simba Rashi Murui from Zimbabwe. I would like to start by asking simply, as someone active in the energy sector, the current shift to clean energy is of interest to me. Fossil fuel majors like Shell have begun divesting from HFO assets, preparing for an energy transition. Seeing as new generation projects are now being geared towards cleaner energy with lesser emissions and productive use, is it safe to say that large organizations are now making social impact part and parcel of their bottom line? Or from the study you had, will you conclude that it's just a charade to satisfy some sort of checklist? That was a question to you, Professor Kramer.
I'm sorry, I was just dealing with a technical issue. I apologize. If you don't mind, please repeat the question.
Sure, no problem. I was asking, we see that major fossil fuel companies like Shell have started divesting from HFO assets and preparing for some sort of shift towards clean energy. And I'm asking if you think that major organizations are making social impact part and parcel of their bottom line, or from your study, would you conclude that it is sort of a charade towards satisfying some sort of checklist?
I think I have to say for most companies in the oil and gas business, it is still a charade. I've been studying recently an interesting activist hedge fund in the United States that took on ExxonMobil and was able to elect 3 directors to their board over the objection of management. And the entire reason they wanted to put these directors on the board was to try and shift the direction that ExxonMobil is moving to actually address the climate change issues and move toward renewables. Even so, with 3 directors on the board, it's not clear that Exxon will make that shift. I think the oil and gas industry is perhaps the hardest industry to shift from the historical model to where we need to go. I think Shell, BP, others are making efforts, but they are still peripheral. And honestly, they're in a difficult spot because as oil prices rise, and they've risen a lot lately, there is money to be made in the old business model. And there are shareholders who expect that money to be made. One of the consequences of divestment movement is that the shareholders who are left in oil and gas companies are not concerned about climate change, because those who are concerned have actually divested of the shares.
Right.
And so it becomes even harder to move these companies forward. So I'm sorry to say, I do think that these are examples of companies that are resistant to moving and are not nearly changing the way they need to.
That is sad to hear, because oil and gas activities affect the society more than an environment, more than most other industries. All right, I will turn to my colleagues, Ala Mohamed. Ala has a very impressive background. Having started her first initiative at age 17, has been an active member of society since then, helping and empowering the youth to discover and learn new talents. Ala is a 2020 Anzisha Prize winner, as well as the bronze holder of the Duke of Edinburgh International Award. She is the co-founder of Taslama, a business development entity that works to maximize impact by empowering women via on-demand delivery services in other development communities in northern Egypt. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam. Hello, Mark. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to have this discussion with you and have the opportunity to ask you questions. So as you were talking about the initiatives the young entrepreneurs are willing to have in the continent. And we need to have good numbers to have investment, but we built our company by shared value, by shared values mindset, and we need to move forward to make what we aimed for. So, as a startup, how can we track and measure the impact of sustainability activities on core business metrics to balance between having good numbers and building something we are passionate about and we want to benefit our society with?
So I think there's some tremendous work going on in how to measure social and environmental impact. And what's happened is we've moved from a model where, the people who were most interested decades ago in measuring social impact were charities, NGOs, donors, foundations. And they had a very different approach than companies. And frankly, companies resisted the idea of having their social impact measured because they knew that in many cases, the results would be not good. But we are seeing real progress today. And there's a wonderful and interesting initiative called the Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative. And I encourage you to go online and look that up and study their work. What they're doing is monetizing social and environmental impacts. And they're looking at the environmental impact, they're looking at the employment impact, and they're looking at the impact of the product or service that the company makes. And they're actually able to look across thousands of companies and enable one to compare from company to company what kind of impact these companies are having, positive or negative, on each of these major issues. And you can actually look in an industry and see that one company is showing a profit, but if you actually take into account the social costs to society, they are at a tremendous loss. And another company in the same industry is actually not only generating a financial profit, but is generating benefits to society on top of that, that would increase their profitability if you counted those. And so we're beginning to get very sophisticated in how we measure social and environmental impact. The challenge that remains, I think, is to link impact with profitability. Because right now, even companies that are doing a sophisticated job of reporting on their social and financial impact are doing it separately from their financial reporting. And as a result, what I see far too many times is that the commitments that companies are making on their social and environmental side are absolutely incompatible with the commitments they are making on their business side about the growth and profitability they expect. In many cases, companies cannot realistically achieve their social environmental goals and their business goals at the same time. So I believe what's missing is the linkage between the social and environmental goal and the financial performance of the company. And that's where we need to get much more sophisticated.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's what we are trying to build in the startup. We are not just focusing on profits. We focus on making money for sure, but we build something to help people. So that's what we focus on, despite all the other opportunities.
Okay. Well, you have to focus on making money at some point. It's not a business if you don't focus on making money.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I'm coughing. Don't be alarmed, it's not COVID. South Africa loves me so much that when I get my allergies get excited. So please don't be alarmed. Before I move to Simba, I would like to say it's a conversation between us and Professor Kramer. So if anybody in the audience would like to ask a question, please feel free to write it or signal our host, Talifani or Nicole, and then they will prompt us, then we can present the question. So now I will tag Simba. Simba is a man of many hats. Simba is the general manager of Rio Energy, a subsidiary of Rio Zim Limited, a Zimbabwe Stock Exchange-listed mining company. Simba is an independent, non-executive director of the Stanbic Bank, Zimbabwe, as well as Petrotrade Limited, under the Zimbabwe Ministry of Energy and Power Development. In addition, he is a member of the board of directors for the Institute of Directors of Zimbabwe, a previous member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Entrepreneurship for 2018-2019, and has been awarded the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Fellowship by the African Leadership Institute and the Oxford University Said Business School. In both 2018 and 2016, he was named by Forbes magazine as one of Africa's 30 most promising and inspirational young entrepreneurs. Kaching.
I thought it would be shorter. Thank you for having Mr. Kramer. I think my question is more rudimentary. I think you've mentioned that there's been a resistance by business. As much as there have been successes recorded, there has been a resistance by a lot of businesses towards the shared value model. And I've also seen that there's a focus on the entrepreneurship. And my thought was, is there a future envisioned or an opportunity to start teaching the shared value model as low as high school? Much like they'll teach financial literacy, much like they'll teach management of business. Because if we can't change the way businesses think from a top-down method, from directorship to management, maybe we can influence the thinking from the shop floor level, moving upwards by bringing in a new generation of executives, of entrepreneurs in various industries that are already in tune, already have been sensitized or schooled on the shared value model.
Yes, I think that would be wonderful. I have to say I'm having a hard enough time teaching it to MBA students. But I do believe that it needs to be brought in at an earlier stage. And, the reason I believe that is that our view of the world is shaped by the social narratives that are out there that we have come to accept. And many of those social narratives are just plain wrong. And without correcting those false narratives, it becomes impossible to really make change, to move to a different model. And so I find that there is a false narrative still that says if you're serious about making money, you shouldn't care about the social or environmental consequences of your actions. And if you really care about social and environmental actions, you shouldn't try and be making money. You should go into the nonprofit sector. And that's completely false. And there's lots of contrary evidence. But until we can start to tell a different story, and I agree, we need to start telling it to people in high school or younger. We need it to pervade society. We will never really make the change that needs to happen in business. So I completely agree with that.
Okay. Well, Professor Kramer, I read an article you wrote about collective impact, and you gave examples about Walmart and Yara and how they were able to drive certain changes by implementing collective impact. As I was reading that article, something struck me, and I just wondered, is there a negative side to this where this could easily be morphed into some sort of negative monopoly in the industry or sector, or even create some sort of cartel, for say? Have you experienced anything like that?
So the story that you're describing, for example, with Yara, has to do with working in Tanzania to create an agricultural cluster that can help 2 million smallhold farmers increase their incomes and hopefully lift them out of poverty. And what Yara did that was so remarkable is bring together 70 different companies that all have an interest in the agricultural sector there and all have a role to play, along with the government and Minister of Agriculture, along with the World Bank and the Rockefeller Foundation, and importantly, along with representatives from those farmers, to come together and agree on a plan going forward that would actually change conditions on the ground. And one of the things they realized is, it's great to put in roads so people can get their crops to the port, but that doesn't really help if people don't have access to good agricultural inputs and fertilizers and seeds and so on. And you can give them agricultural inputs and seeds and fertilizers, but they need to be able to pay for it. And that means they need access to financing. And you can give them all of those inputs and the financing and the roads, but they need irrigation to be able to grow those crops, so they need electricity. And it turns out there's a long list of things that are interdependent, and solving one piece of the problem doesn't actually get you anywhere unless you're able to solve all of the parts of the problem in a sequence and coordinated way. And so what Yara was able to do with this coalition of more than 100 players was develop a common agenda for how they can move towards solving these systemic problems and agree on a measurement system so that they can track progress toward this goal together on the same parameters, and to begin to develop mutually reinforcing activities so that when the World Bank was building roads, it was aligned with what a private company was doing about creating power. And it was aligned with what crops were needed that could be sold in the market and so on. So this kind of cross-sector collaboration, I have come to believe, is tremendously important to the success of initiatives that are really trying to solve social problems at scale. Now, the question you ask is whether this model, which we called collective impact, can be harmful. And yes, I think it can. I think the most important element of this collaboration was the fact that it actually included smallhold farmers themselves. I think all too often we try and solve somebody else's problems without asking them what is needed from their point of view and what the consequences of our potential solutions would be. And so I do think that engaging the people who have lived experience of the problem is one essential safety check in using collective impact as a way to achieve social harmony.